Now, what's perilous here is that Milton Friedman and a gentleman by the name of Franco Modigliani in the 1950s became preoccupied with diversions from that norm. And what they were describing essentially are microeconomic phenomena. Say, give you the example that Friedman wrote about in his PhD dissertation. He talked about, well, farmers, for example, don't have steady incomes. So are they going to spend on a year-to-year basis on their up and down incomes, or are they going to try to smooth it out over their lifetime? Well, he knew the answer. They smooth it out. They try to borrow in lean years, and they try to sock away a little bit of money in good years and even it out, you know. And so what he did was he did that, and then he did another study where he looked at medical students who were very poor when they were in school, but they were going to be rich, and they actually spend more when they took it because they knew they were going to have money to burn a little bit later, so they borrowed and bought cars and houses and tried to get established, especially if they saw that interest rates were rising and it was easier to borrow today rather than tomorrow. And, you know, so he did one of these stories after another and then assumed that, well, you know, so the basic consumption function really doesn't work like he said it does. You know, that maybe rich people, in a lot of cases, spend all the money too. So progressive taxation is not going to do what it says it can do. And it's complete crap. Because he's making a microeconomic statement about a macroeconomic function. And it's indeed when finally economists about 10 years ago, and if you stop me afterward, I can refer you to a couple of these studies, but they finally actually did surveys. Okay, well, how does it actually work? Let's look at the real data. Who spends, who saves? And it's just as Keynes said, you know, back in 1936. The rich still save more than the poor, and the poor still have to spend every dime they get. One of the real, you know, sometimes it's difficult when you're looking at this and you're dealing with colleagues who you can't get them to see it the way you see it. And you wonder if they're just not seeing it or whether they're lying. And I've come to believe that in this arena there's a lot of deceit. Because one of the studies on which they based some of the counter theories that it doesn't quite work out like Keynes said it is, were some Census Bureau studies that were longitudinal, that, you know, over time, and it was kind of like the old saw about the trunk looking for the car keys where the light is the best, you know, where he lost the car keys. In this case, what they did was they used the only data for families that were intact over that whole period. And so they left out immigrant populations, they left out a lot of the poor that, you know, whose families were broken up, and, you know, and it was a nuclear family study, mostly middle-class white people. And, you know, it looked a little, our class system in this country looked a little more mobile than it really was. And, you know, Friedman talked about what he called a permanent income hypothesis. So you may be poor now, but you know you're going to be rich later. And so you're going to smooth your spending over your lifetime to account for that. And he pretended, he does a really sophisticated mathematical modeling of this too, but if you unwind all that, what you see is that he pretends that people somehow know about what the interest rates are going to be 30 years from now. And, you know, they make estimates of spending based on that. And of course everybody does guesswork, and of course everybody fluctuates their spending based on, you know, I've got a job interview coming up, and I think I'm going to get it, and I'm going to get paid a little bit more, and let's go out to dinner tonight, you know? I mean, that always happens, but as a norm and on the mean, you know, the Keynesian consumption function still works. Yes?
Hi, sorry, I came in late, so you may have addressed this already, so excuse me if you did, but as I understood you, when I first came in, you were talking about the Keynesian view of interest rates helping to drive redistribution, being low, that is. But my concern is that...
It doesn't drive redistribution at all, it just drives investment.
Okay, but, well, okay, but here's what I want to say. In a low interest rate environment in the normal world, that would be true, but what we've got now are banks who get the benefit of the low interest rate because they can borrow the money at a low rate, but
they speculate.
They hold on to it and they're not lending it out. Now, Obama has put out a lot of verbiage about how they need to free it up, but they're not doing it, and there is no mandate for that, and therefore they get the benefit. And who gets the low interest rate loans? Only the guys at the top with perfect credit who already have money and don't need it, not the little guys like the average citizen. They're not getting it. And that's not driving anything. All it's doing is driving more more wealth at the high end.
You're right.
Right, okay, so, and now one other point I wanted to say that the other thing about high interest rates, if I may play devil's advocate,
Yes.
driving investment, you're not addressing the fact that one of the best things about high interest rates, you have to compete now in the world market for interest rates. And we are not competitive if we have low interest rates and you can go buy a German bond at a higher rate. So you've got low rates, devalues our dollar, makes it virtually worthless. And then, if you had higher rates, you'd be more competitive to drive investment in dollar-denominated securities. And right now, the only one buying our securities is our own government, is our own Fed. Our own government. We print it, and then we buy it
Chinese and the
back.
Canadians and the British.
It's completely a false market. It's an illusion.
All those points are true and valid. But Keynes would have argued, and I argued, that they're irrelevant. Because what he argued, and this very matter, especially about the competitive devaluations, internationally, was something that he was preoccupied with from the 1920s after World War I, right on up to his death in 1946, when he spearheaded the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 to deal with that very matter. And what he argued was that essentially, yeah. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. What he
Yeah, what he argued was that if you tended your own shop, that is, you used these other tools, you needed the low long-term interest rate regime as a backstop and as the foundation, but these were necessary too. Compensatory fiscal policy, you had to have redistribution based on, built into your fiscal policy itself, which he assumed was a given then, and I assume it's somewhat of a given today. If you did that, the international trade network was essentially unimportant to the eventual fate of your economy. It represented such a small portion of your GDP, and that comparative advantage would work out if countries all went in this direction, to the point where the real distinctions between one country and another would soon dissolve.
Do you think that's a valid thing to say in this world now, in this world market?
It is not.
That
For one,
international trade is irrelevant?
No.
The trade deficit is
no,
irrelevant?
but it's for one big reason that still kind of stems from our misunderstanding of this, and that is that we have conflated free trade with free markets. They're not the same. Keynes was a free trader. He believed that countries should be free to trade without tariff barriers and quotas and these kind of walls between them. And he also believed that eventually the distinctions between them, as they all grew, well, not just wealthier, but more evenly prosperous. That is, as a middle class would grow up in these countries. If a country had an advantage and they did Keynesian policy, their poor and their middle class would prosper. And when that happens, these differences between the countries sort of go away. They never go away completely, but they go away mostly. Now the trouble is that we've rejected really all three of these, but especially the lower two. And therefore free trade doesn't work anymore that way. And it can eclipse economies, and it can bring them down. And so essentially it becomes a race to the bottom rather than a race to the top. It could be a race to the top, and it's not that it's a pie-in-the-sky approach either, because we actually did it that way in the 1960s. And this is when countries like Mexico and Brazil actually started building a little bit of a middle class, but it was so short-lived that it never really made its mark.
Well, I only want to say it's a very different world today, a very different economic situation today than the 60s even. But the other thing is, I'm sorry.
She said it's a very different world today than compared to the 60s, and it is, yeah.
And the other thing is just that,
Policy.
if I could just throw one little point out, I think that
speak up?
what's called for
I'll repeat what she says.
what's called for is a mandate to the banks to make this money available instead of just lip service that Obama gives, and while they sit there and hoard it and loan it to the richest
All right, well now, that was her second point that I did not address. She said what's needed is a mandate to make banks cough up the money that they're stockpiling, essentially. Well, again, this fits in with this. If you don't do enough of the bottom of the pyramid, and you don't understand the compensatory policy in the middle, then there's not going to be demand for money. And so the banks are not going to loan it to anybody if they don't come knocking at their door. Now, we all know about exceptions to that rule where people are rejected and they haven't gotten the money they've sought. But part of that, not all of it, is based on a risk assessment in a depressed economy. And so, again, I think there's an answer. Maybe it's pie in the sky. You're right. Our policy environment is different today. Our economic environment is not. We're not in a new economy. The same principles apply. We just have different, aberrant, destructive policy framework. And, if you give up on the possibility for having a better policy framework, then, as Keynes once famously remarked, well, in the long run, we're all dead. We're screwed. So you've got to start somewhere, I think. All right, let me move on and wrap this up so we can pass it off to the next speaker. Now, when it comes to compensatory policy, here's one of the famous quotes from the general theory, and this speaks to the issue of how military Keynesianism can fit in. Keynes was too clever with his language sometimes, and so if you read this, you'll see that it's, he's a little bit jocular, and a lot of people who are, I just can't imagine being so obtuse that you would read this and say, oh yeah, earthquakes are good, and let's have some military spending, because he said it actually works, Well, that's not what he was saying. He was saying that this is like the worst possible way to do this. If this is how dumb our politicians are, and they default to this, or count on earthquakes to lift us up, well, it'll work, but not very well, and we're stupid if we think we can't do any better. I mean, that's essentially what he was saying. But this has been widely misinterpreted as an endorsement of military Keynesianism. Walter Heller, the chief economic advisor to Lyndon Johnson, put it another way when he found that Johnson's plea, repeated over and over again, fell on deaf ears. That was that, yes, accuse me of getting us ensnared in Vietnam for the wrong reasons, for protracting this bloody war, for how I view it in terms of the conflict with the North Vietnamese, with the predation, communist predation there, protection of South Vietnamese allies. Go ahead and criticize me on that ground. And it's something that I regret, and I wish we could get out of it tomorrow, but I still see a place there. But don't say that we're fighting this war because it's good for the economy. Don't say, I want this war because I cannot do anything else to lift the economy. And he said this over and over again, and people didn't listen to him because he had blood on his hands. And, it was a passionate, emotional time. So his chief advisor, Heller, said this kind of thing over and over again, pleading with the country to say, saying essentially, we don't need Vietnam. We really don't. We're doing fine without it. We'll do better without it, in fact. Please believe this, and believe that our president thinks this too. And I think we overlooked that kind of approach at our peril in the 1960s, because when we threw out his regime because of Vietnam, we threw out the good economic policies too. Now, so what did Ike overlook? This is what I think it boils down to. That if you have this inverted pyramid type approach that I showed you earlier, and it requires the redistribution and compensatory fiscal policy to make an economy really hum and tick and work for all of its people, then military Keynesianism, and this goes back to Keynes' quote about how stupid it was to rely on, has these kinds of deficiencies that really stand out, especially the first one. And Robert Naiman, who will speak after me, will focus on the first one here, the low multiplier, the idea that, when you take $1 and spend it on the military, it doesn't go as far into the economy as $1 spent on education or healthcare, or today we're talking about green jobs. You could invent a number of categories, or not even invent, but just spend it traditionally the way we always have. schools, roads, bridges, healthcare, public safety, cops on the street, harking back to the Clinton administration. And it works so much better. So that low multiplier is the first and foremost handicap. But often overlooked are these others. Low spin-off potential because of the R&D and the way it works in the military. It's kept close to the vest. These are not competitive industries. They tend, even though in World War II, they tended to be consumer-oriented industries that also did military stuff, as Ike mentioned in his speech. That doesn't happen so much anymore. They only do military contracting, so you don't get the spin-off that you used to get in World War II. Even in Vietnam, we forget the 1960s was the age of the conglomerate, if some of you remember that phrase. And these companies were taking profits from their war contracts. Sadly, there were too many of those, and sadly, they were making too much money fighting a bloody war, but they were taking and they were putting them into their consumer divisions and, making cheaper and better products for people. And that, not much solace there in that kind of a transaction, but it was happening. It doesn't happen so much anymore today. Corporate cost problem. The other thing that's often overlooked here, and this forms a critical part of some of my research when I look at inflation, is that central to the problem of inflation, as I see it, is the way corporate costs are out of control, not at the bottom of the framework, that is, the workers, that's the traditional way of describing this, but at the top, executive compensation, managerial bureaucracies, things like that. Because of the superannuated profits that come with military spending and military contracting, they lead the way in this kind of regime. They prop up these unwieldy, expensive, highly compensated executive, managerial bureaucracies that are copied by the rest of the economy. And they form a kind of a blueprint. And this is at the core of our cost problem that bleeds over to inflation. And then, it presents other problems that I'll get to in a second. Gun belt, hot, cold spots. If you choose to use the military as your chief jobs program and as a way to, approach use a bastardized version of Keynesianism, what you're going to get are hot and cold spots. And we've all seen this. Now, one of the overlooked problems, there's many of them related to this, but one that I like to focus on because it's become so preeminent in recent years is what this does to real estate markets. When you have hot and cold real estate markets, what that does is it ramps up speculation. Because you've got, hot spots where everybody wants to go, cold spots where nobody can afford to leave because they can't get enough to buy the sale of their house. And that promotes great speculation and even a wider gap. It depresses labor mobility. It bleeds into costs in other parts of the economy because real estate costs are at the base of the cost for all businesses and people. And it's a real serious problem. And you can see that emerging in the 1980s in a really big way once Reagan made the full plunge to a kind of a military Keynesianism that we had left behind for a few decades.
Can I ask you a question? Are you saying that this is a natural phenomenon that occurs because of sources of income, like around DC, you've got a hot spot because that's where all the money is, so people congregate there, or are you saying that's a controlled, deliberate?
I'm saying it's natural. It's natural once you set up your economy in this problematic structural way.
Well, you're saying set up the economy.
Set up because it's a deliberate decision to say we're going to have a jobs program that's built on military spending. And when you do that, when you make that decision, this is what you're left with. But it is a natural outgrowth of that structure, having made that decision.
And we all trickle right down to refugees, right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, everybody's caught that vice. Yeah.
Somebody can ask questions, and
Yeah, well,
nobody can hear the questions.
Yeah, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards, so we can do it that way. Deunionization, quickly. Here it's hard to distinguish between what the gun belt and the military contractors have done versus everybody else because everybody wants to be unionized today. But it's clearly been encouraged and ramped up by virtue of having a large military-industrial complex. Principally because the one rationalization that worked there that didn't always work in the private sector was that we've got this national security problem, we can't afford a work stoppage, we're making critical weapons, if they go on strike, we're going to have a real problem. Harry Truman had this problem with steel workers during Korea, and he tried to shut down and seize the steel mills, and it's a perennial problem, and that was firmly in the memory of Americans who kind of set this up. So the military-industrial complex has been an entering wedge and a leading wedge for deunionization. Now, I probably don't have to elaborate and tell you why that's a bad thing. But if you understood what I said earlier about redistribution and how getting more money in the hands of the people at the bottom is a good way to run an economy versus the top, then you know what this means. Okay? Inflation, stagflation, it kind of stems back to that corporate cost problem I talked about, with one added element. When you do this, and you have inflation, and yet the historic trend is to blame workers, or blame employment that's too full, too many dollars chasing too few goods, you've heard that over and over again. And that's not the source of the inflation. It's more of a micro phenomenon within corporations. When it's set up that way, and then we respond traditionally, as Keynes warned us against, by raising interest rates, then that top of the pyramid lever is broken. And so you get stagflation. You get a bad economy, and the inflation roars on. And then last of all, which is the most subtle perhaps, is the hyper-financialization. I did an oral history of venture capital one time with the local business school. And they eventually dumped the whole project because they were disappointed with my findings. And what I found was that they wanted to tell a story, and it started in the 1940s when the venture capital industry began. They wanted to tell a story of bootstrap capitalism. These cowboy entrepreneurs taking risks and sticking their necks out and doing great things for the economy. And this was 1999, so the internet age was alive, and venture capitalists were crawling all over the landscape. And I worked with a guy in Fontainebleau, France, in INSEAD on this, who was a pretty smart guy. And we started digging and interviewing people. What we found was all of them were tied to defense contractors. I mean, all of them, just from the very beginning. The godfather of venture capitalism was a guy named General George Doria, a Frenchman who came to the United States and was involved with Pentagon contracting. And this is where you get the nexus between Bell Labs and MIT and the Jet Propulsion Lab, whatever, in California, and the universities are, as David Swanson told us yesterday, really implicit in all this sort of thing. Well, it begins with venture capital. Now, why is that significant? If Wall Street wants to tell a story today, as it often does, that it's a source of efficient allocation of capital and a source of investment that lifts the whole economy, which is complete and utter bullshit. If you look at the average year, companies buy back more stock than they sell. So it's often a source of disinvestment, not investment. It's a casino. Okay? It's a gambling casino. But if you want to tell the other story that it's a source of investment, you point to venture capital. Because you can talk about startup companies and new jobs. And they're there, and it happens. But that's on the margin. And so what I'm arguing here, it's kind of a subtle point, but our hyper-focus on military contracting over the years has lifted this story up where it doesn't belong. It's told us a story about Wall Street that just isn't true, and it's led to the over-financialization of our economy. So I'll end with that, and I'll pass it off to